The basement air hung thick with dust and memories. Shafts of afternoon sunlight cut through small windows, illuminating dancing particles in the cold Pennsylvania air. Robert Mitchell stood motionless at the bottom of the stairs, his weathered hands gripping the wooden banister. At 78, his tall frame remained straight, a testament to military bearing that had never left him, even as his hair had turned from sandy brown to silver. The cardboard boxes stacked against the wall represented the final task he had been avoiding for months. Martha would have wanted him to do this sooner, 3 months since the funeral, and her voice still echoed in his mind. "Those boxes aren't going to sort themselves, Bobby," she would have said, with that smile that had sustained him for over 7 decades. The old floorboards creaked under his careful steps as he approached the far corner of the basement. This section had remained untouched for decades, ever since they had moved the last of the children's things upstairs to make room for Martha's canning supplies. Now, with Martha gone, the farm quiet, and his children scattered across the country with families of their own, there was no reason to keep postponing the inevitable. The first box opened easily, revealing Christmas ornaments wrapped in yellowing newspaper from the 1970s. The second contained old tax returns, neatly bundled and labeled in Martha's precise handwriting. It was the third box that made Robert's hands tremble slightly. Unlike the others, this one was metal, olive drab, with faded stenciling still visible on the side. CPT-R Mitchell, 2nd Armored Div. The latches were stiff with age and disuse. When the lid finally opened, the scent that escaped was like a time machine. Old paper, leather, and something else. Something he hadn't smelled in nearly 80 years. Gun oil, military-issue gun oil, with its distinctive chemical signature that never quite left a soldier's memory. Inside lay his past, carefully preserved. The silver star in its case, 3 purple hearts. The worn leather wallet containing faded photographs of young men in uniform, standing proudly beside their Sherman tank. Their names came to him immediately, as if no time had passed. Johnny Romano, William Thompson, Hank Wilson, James Miller. His crew, his brothers, all gone now. Beneath the medals and photographs was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. His war diary, begun in basic training and maintained until that final day in April 1945. He had never shown it to anyone, not even Martha. Some burdens weren't meant to be shared. As he lifted the journal, something metallic clinked against the bottom of the box. Robert reached in and pulled out a piece of metal, roughly the size of his palm, curved slightly, with the unmistakable emblem of an eagle clutching a swastika. A fragment of armor plating from a German tank, taken as a souvenir from the battlefield. Not just any tank, a Tiger. "Never thought I'd look at you again," Robert whispered to the piece of metal, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet basement. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the cold solidity that had once been part of the most fearsome war machine ever built. The sudden ringing of the telephone upstairs startled him. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but decades of habitual politeness wouldn't allow it. Setting the metal fragment on top of the journal, he made his way slowly up the stairs, joints protesting with each step. "Mitchell residence," he answered in the formal tone he had never abandoned. "Grandpa Bob, it's Jason. Are you sitting down? I've got news you won't believe." Robert smiled at the sound of his grandson's voice, so full of energy and enthusiasm. At 35, Jason was building a career as a documentary filmmaker, specializing in military history, a passion Robert had quietly encouraged but never fully engaged with. "I'm standing, but I can take whatever news you've got, son. What is it?" "They found one, Grandpa. A complete Tiger Y. The Armor Museum at Fort Knox has been restoring it for the past 3 years in secret, and they're unveiling it next month. It's one of only 6 intact tigers left in the world." Robert's free hand sought the back of a kitchen chair, and he lowered himself into it. A complete Tiger One after all these years. "That's fascinating, Jason," he managed, his voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of his heart rate. "I'm sure it will make an impressive exhibit." "Impressive? It's extraordinary. This is the holy grail of World War II armor. And here's the best part. I've been commissioned to film the unveiling ceremony and create a documentary about it. They're bringing in experts from around the world, but what they really need are veterans who actually face these beasts in combat." The silence stretched between them for several seconds. "Grandpa, are you still there?" "I'm here, Jason." Robert's eyes drifted toward the basement door, thinking of the journal and the metal fragment waiting below. But I don't think I can help you with this one. Why not? You were there. 2nd Armored Division, the European theater. You had to have seen tigers in action. Robert closed his eyes. I never talk about the war, Jason. You know that. But this is different, Jason pressed. This isn't just about war stories. This is about preserving history, about documenting the experiences of the few veterans still with us, who can tell the world what it was really like to face these machines. The ceremony is on April 15th at Fort Knox. I could arrange everything. The museum would cover all expenses. April 15th, just 2 weeks away. Robert felt a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with his age. I'll think about it, he finally said, knowing it was easier than an outright refusal. Send me the details. After hanging up, Robert stood motionless in his kitchen, surrounded by the artifacts of his life with Martha. The copper-bottomed pots hanging above the stove. The collection of decorative plates from all 50 states, accumulated during their retirement road trips. The refrigerator door covered with photographs of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. A life built after the war, a good life, filled with love and purpose and the quiet dignity of working the land. A life that had nothing to do with the thunder of artillery or the screech of tank treads on cobblestone streets. The television in the living room was still on, tuned to the news channel that had become his constant companion since Martha's passing. As he moved to turn it off, the words World War II caught his attention. The news anchor was talking about the very thing Jason had just mentioned, the Tiger tank restoration at Fort Knox. Considered the most formidable tank of World War II, the German Tiger struck fear into Allied forces with its thick armor and devastating 88mm rear gun, the anchor was saying. This particular Tiger, designated with serial number 250122, was captured near Kassel, Germany in the final weeks of the war. Robert froze, the remote control halfway to the television. Serial number 250122. It couldn't be. The screen showed footage of museum workers carefully restoring the massive tank. Its distinctive angular turret and overlapping wheel system, unmistakable, even under decades of corrosion and damage. With shaking hands, Robert returned to the basement, moving faster than he had in years. He retrieved the journal from atop the metal box and flipped through the brittle pages until he found the entry he sought. April 10th, 1945. The last battle. There it was, written in his own youthful hand, the ink faded but still legible. Engaged and disabled, Tiger number 250122 near Kassel. Wagner's tank. God help me, I hope he made it out. The same tank, after 80 years, the very machine he had faced in his final battle, was about to be unveiled to the world as a museum piece, a curiosity for school children and history buffs to gawk at. Robert closed the journal and looked at the piece of metal with the Nazi eagle. He had taken it from that very tank as a reminder, though of what, he had never been entirely sure. Perhaps as proof that the monster could be defeated. Perhaps as a memorial to those who didn't live to see the victory. His decision was made before he even returned upstairs. He would go to Fort Knox. After 80 years of silence, it was time to tell the truth about what happened that day near Kassel. Time to honor the memory of his crew and of the man on the other side of the battle who had, in the strangest of ways, become a part of his life's story. He picked up the phone to call Jason back, but paused before dialing. First, there was something he needed to do, something he should have done decades ago. From the drawer beside the telephone, Robert retrieved a notepad and pen. In his careful, measured handwriting, he began a letter addressed to a name and address in Stuttgart, Germany, that he knew by heart, though he had never sent a letter there before. To the family of Heinrich Wagner. The letter would have to wait. First, he would go to Fort Knox. First, he would see the Tiger once more. The following day found Robert Mitchell driving his aging pickup truck along the familiar roads of his rural Pennsylvania county. The destination was Hunters Creek Cemetery, where Martha rested beneath a simple granite headstone next to the reserved space that would one day be his own. It was a ritual he performed twice weekly, bringing fresh flowers and spending time in quiet conversation with the woman who had been his anchor for 75 years. This visit was different. Today he brought no flowers. Instead, he carried his journal and a decision. I'm going to Kentucky, Martha, he said, standing before her grave. The April morning was cool, dew still clinging to the manicured grass. They found Wagner's Tiger. After all this time, Jason wants me to tell the story for his documentary. He paused as if waiting for a response that would never come. I know what you'd say. You tell me it's about time I talked about it, that some burdens aren't meant to be carried alone forever. A robin landed nearby, regarding him with curious eyes before resuming its search for breakfast. I never told you everything about the war, about Wagner, about what really happened that day. The confession hung in the cemetery air, too late for the one person he had wanted to share it with. I thought I was protecting you. Maybe I was just protecting myself. The drive back to this farmhouse was filled with memories that had been carefully locked away for decades. Basic training at Fort Knox in 1943, the sea voyage to England aboard a crowded transport ship, the beaches of Normandy, not on D-Day but 2 weeks later, when the sand was still dark with the blood of those who had gone before. And the first time he saw a Tiger tank. As Robert pulled into his driveway, his neighbor Tom Caldwell was checking his mail at the roadside boxes that served their adjacent properties. "Morning, Bob," called Tom, a relative newcomer at only 15 years on his farm. "Heading somewhere? Saw you loading a suitcase earlier." Robert nodded, climbing slowly from his truck. "Kentucky. My grandson is working on a film project at Fort Knox. Asked me to come down and participate." Tom's eyebrows rose. "Fort Knox, that's where all the gold is, right?" "In the Armor Museum," Robert added. "They're unveiling a restored German tank from the war, a Tiger." The blank look on Tom's face reminded Robert of the gulf that separated his generation from those that followed. To Tom, World War II was ancient history, as remote as the Civil War had been to Robert in his youth. "I served with the 2nd Armored," Robert explained, something he rarely volunteered. "Saw a few Tigers up close during the push into Germany." Tom whistled. "No kidding? You never mentioned that." "Never seemed important to mention." Robert checked his own mailbox, finding it empty. "Martha always handled the mail," he added, more to himself than to his neighbor. "Well, safe travels," Tom said, sensing the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "Let me know if you need anything checked while you're gone." Robert thanked him and continued to the house, where his packed suitcase waited by the door. Jason had arranged everything: the flight from Philadelphia to Louisville, the hotel room near the base, the museum passes. All Robert had to do was show up with his memories and his courage. The basement beckoned once more. There was one last item he needed for this journey. From a wooden cabinet that had once belonged to his father, Robert withdrew a small wooden box lined with green felt. Inside, nestled like a precious jewel, was his Colt M1911A1 service pistol, preserved in perfect condition through decades of careful maintenance. It wasn't coming with him to Kentucky. Regulations and common sense prohibited that. But he needed to see it once more, to hold the weight of it in his palm and remember the young man who had carried it across Europe. The young man who had faced the Tiger with nothing but this pistol, his training, and the unbreakable bond with 4 other young Americans in a Sherman tank nicknamed Mustang Sally. As he closed the pistol case and returned it to the cabinet, Robert's mind traveled back to 1944, to the fields of France, where he had first learned what it meant to be a tank commander in the greatest conflict the world had ever known. June 1944. Normandy, France. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the narrow country roads into muddy troughs that bogged down everything from jeeps to the massive supply trucks bringing ammunition and fuel to the front. For the Sherman tanks of the 2nd Armored Division, the conditions were challenging but navigable. The tracked vehicles handled the mud better than wheeled transport, a small advantage in a campaign that needed every edge it could get. Corporal Robert Mitchell, newly promoted to tank commander after the death of his predecessor during the landing, sat in the open turret hatch of Mustang Sally, maps spread across his knees under a makeshift shelter fashioned from a poncho. At 19, he was younger than every man in his crew except for Hank Wilson, the driver who had just turned 18 the week before deployment. "You figure out where the hell we are yet, Mitch?" called Johnny Romano from below, his Brooklyn accent echoing in the confined space of the tank's interior. "About 5 miles southeast of St. Lo," Robert replied, squinting at the map through the rain. "Command wants us to hold this crossroads until Baker Company moves up from the beach." "In this rain?" William Thompson's voice carried the soft drawl of his East Texas upbringing. "Baker Company will be lucky to get here by Christmas." Robert folded the map carefully and ducked back inside the turret, pulling the hatch closed against the downpour. The interior of the Sherman was cramped, smelling of wet wool uniforms, gun oil, and the ever-present underlying odor of fuel. But after 2 weeks in Normandy, it had become home. "Orders are orders," he said, settling into the commander's seat. "We hold the crossroads. Wrench, how's our ammunition situation?" Johnny Wrench Romano, the tank's mechanic and loader, gestured to the carefully stacked shells behind him. 26 armor-piercing, 42 high-explosive, and about 2,000 rounds for the machine guns. We're good unless we run into a Panzer convention. Robert nodded. Their Sherman M4A3 was equipped with the newer 76mm gun, an improvement over the 75mm that most American tanks still carried, but still undermatched against the heavier German armor. The strategy remained the same: rely on mobility and numbers. It took 5 Shermans to reliably knock out one Panzer IV, and the new Panthers were even tougher. No one mentioned the Tigers. In training, they had been told that Tiger tanks were rare, deployed only in specific sectors and in limited numbers due to their cost and complexity. Intelligence suggested they would be unlikely to encounter one in their sector. Intelligence would prove catastrophically wrong. The rain finally stopped around midnight. Robert, taking his turn on watch while the others tried to sleep in the uncomfortable confines of the tank, noticed the change immediately. The constant drumming on the turret ceased, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery miles to the south. By dawn, a thin mist covered the Norman countryside, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. Robert scanned the crossroads through his binoculars, alert for any movement along the 4 muddy roads that converged near their position. They had backed the Sherman into a stand of oak trees, providing some concealment while maintaining a clear field of fire toward the most likely approach from the east. "Movement," he said sharply, causing the dozing crew to snap awake instantly. "Eastern Road, about 500 yards. "German?" asked Thompson, already swinging the turret to face the potential threat. Robert adjusted his binoculars. "Can't tell yet, the mist is too thick." The seconds stretched into minutes as they waited, engines off to avoid detection, every man tense and ready. When the shapes finally emerged from the mist, Robert felt a momentary relief. 2 American jeeps, followed by a scout car, moving cautiously along the road toward the crossroads. "Hold fire," he ordered unnecessarily. "It's our guys." He grabbed the signal lamp and flashed the recognition code of the day. 2 long, 1 short. The lead jeep responded correctly, and Robert ordered Wilson to start the engine and move the Sherman out of its concealment. The officer in the lead jeep was a lieutenant from Division Intelligence, his uniform surprisingly clean for someone operating in the field. He approached the Sherman as Robert climbed down to meet him. "Captain Mitchell?" the lieutenant asked, consulting a clipboard. "Corporal Mitchell," Robert corrected. "Captain Bennett was killed during the landing. I'm acting commander of this tank until a replacement officer arrives." The lieutenant made a notation on his clipboard. "Situation's fluid. You might be waiting a while for that replacement. Listen, we've got reports of German armor moving in this sector. Have you seen anything?" Robert shook his head. "Nothing since yesterday. Had a brief engagement with a reconnaissance motorcycle about 10 miles back, but that's it." "Well, they're out there," the lieutenant said, gesturing to a map his driver had spread on the hood of the Jeep. "Intelligence indicates a company-size element. Probably Panzer IVs, maybe a couple of Panthers, moving to cut off our advance towards St. Lo." Robert studied the map, noting the marked positions of known German units. "What's our play?" "Your platoon is being consolidated. The rest of your unit should be arriving within the hour. Once assembled, you're to proceed to this position." The lieutenant pointed to a small village about 7 miles to the southeast. "Set up a blocking position and engage any German armor attempting to move through the sector." 4 Shermans against a company of Panzers? Robert couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. "Those aren't great odds, sir." The lieutenant's expression didn't change. "The odds are what they are, Corporal. This is the situation across the entire front. We're stretched thin until more armor can be brought ashore." He handed Robert a sealed envelope. "These are your official orders. Captain Reynolds will be taking command of your platoon when he arrives." Within 2 hours, the remaining 3 Shermans of Robert's platoon had arrived, along with Captain Daniel Reynolds, a 30-year-old West Point graduate with a thin mustache and the permanent squint of someone who should be wearing glasses but refuses to do so. "Mitchell," Reynolds said after Robert had briefed him on their orders, "your tank will take point. You know the terrain better than the rest of us. Anderson will be on your right flank. Peters and I will follow at 50-yard intervals. Standard column formation until we make contact. Then we deploy for combat." "Yes, sir," Robert replied, studying the captain's face for any sign of nervousness or uncertainty. He found none, just the calm professionalism of a career officer. Whether that would translate to effective leadership in combat remained to be seen. The small column of Shermans moved out just past noon, advancing cautiously along the muddy road toward their assigned blocking position. Robert, standing in the turret with his upper body exposed, kept his binoculars scanning the rolling countryside. The Norman hedgerows, ancient earthen barriers topped with dense vegetation, divided the landscape into a patchwork of small fields, creating perfect ambush positions that could conceal even vehicles as large as tanks. They had covered perhaps 4 miles when Robert heard it, a deep, distinctive rumble that didn't match the sound of their own Sherman engines. He signaled for the column to halt and raised his binoculars, scanning the hedgerow directly ahead of them. "Contact," he said calmly into the intercom. "German armor bearing 035, range approximately 800 yards. "Can you identify?" Reynolds' voice crackled through the radio. Robert adjusted his binoculars, trying to get a better look at the vehicle partially concealed behind the hedgerow. What he saw made his blood run cold. The distinctive angular turret, the overlapping wheel system, the massive long-barreled 88-millimeter gun that could penetrate a Sherman's armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. "Tiger," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Say again, Mitchell? You're breaking up." Reynolds didn't sound concerned yet. Robert cleared his throat. "Tiger tank, sir." "Confirmed. And it's not alone. I count 4 Panthers in support formation." The radio was silent for several seconds. When Reynolds spoke again, his voice had acquired a new tension. "Are you absolutely certain it's a Tiger?" "Positive identification, sir. I've studied the recognition charts. That's a Tiger Y, and it's oriented directly toward our position." Another pause. "They may not have spotted us yet. All tanks reverse. We're pulling back to the last crossroads to regroup." It was the right call. Their 4 Shermans were outclassed by a single Tiger, let alone one supported by 4 Panthers. But as Wilson put Mustang Sally into reverse, the distinctive crack of the Tiger's 88-millimeter gun shattered the countryside silence. The shell passed directly over Robert's tank, missing by mere feet, and impacted on the road behind them, sending a geyser of mud and gravel into the air. "Move!" Robert shouted, dropping down into the turret and securing the hatch. "Full reverse, maximum speed." The Sherman's engine roared as Wilson pushed it to its limits, backing rapidly down the narrow road. Through his periscope, Robert could see the other Shermans doing the same, creating a confused tangle as they tried to turn around in the confined space. The second shot from the Tiger found its mark. The lead tank in their retreat, commanded by Lieutenant Peters, took a direct hit to its front hull. The armor-piercing shell punched through as if the Sherman's protection were made of cardboard, igniting the ammunition stored inside. The resulting explosion lifted the turret completely off the hull, sending it spinning through the air before it crashed into a nearby field. There would be no survivors from that tank. "Hard right," Robert ordered, and Wilson responded instantly, turning the Sherman off the road and through a gap in the hedgerow. They crashed through into a field of young corn, the tracks tearing up the carefully planted rows as they executed a rapid turn to face the threat. "Load armor piercing," Robert commanded, and Romano complied instantly, the shell making a metallic clank as it was rammed into the breech of their 76-millimeter gun. "AP loaded," Romano confirmed. "Target the Tiger. Range 700 and decreasing," Robert instructed Thompson, who was already adjusting his sights. "Aim for the lower front hull, near the driver's position. It's the weakest point." "On target," Thompson replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Fire!" The Sherman's gun roared, the entire tank shuddering with the recoil. Through his periscope, Robert watched the tracer round arc toward the Tiger, praying for a miracle. The shell struck precisely where aimed, but ricocheted off the Tiger's thick frontal armor without penetrating. Robert swore under his breath. Their standard armor-piercing ammunition was simply inadequate against the Tiger's protection. "It bounced off," Thompson reported unnecessarily, loading another round. "Belay that," Robert ordered. "Driver, move us behind that stone barn at 2 o'clock. We need cover." As Wilson maneuvered the tank toward the temporary protection of the sturdy Norman farm building, Robert quickly assessed their situation through his periscope. Captain Reynolds' tank was burning about 300 yards to their right, having taken a hit from one of the Panthers. Lieutenant Anderson's Sherman was nowhere to be seen, either destroyed or having found cover elsewhere. In less than 60 seconds of engagement, their platoon had been reduced from 4 tanks to at most 2, and possibly just 1, Mustang Sally. The Tiger was advancing slowly but inexorably down the center of the road, its 88mm guns scanning for targets, while the Panthers spread out to flank any remaining resistance. The German commander knew he had the advantage and was in no hurry to expose his valuable machines unnecessarily. "Wrench," Robert called to Romano. "What specialized ammunition do we have left?" "Three HVAP rounds," Romano replied, referring to the rare high-velocity armor-piercing shells that offered their best chance against heavy German armor. "Been saving them for a special occasion." "This qualifies," Robert said grimly. "Load HVAP and stand by." As the shell was loaded, Robert quickly formulated a plan. It wasn't much of a plan, born more of desperation than tactical genius, but it was all they had. "Driver, on my command, you're going to move us out from behind this barn and head directly for that drainage ditch about 100 yards to our left. It should give us hull-down protection, exposing only our turret." "The ditch is perpendicular to the Tiger's approach," Wilson noted. "We'll be presenting our side armor to them." "That's why we're going to time this perfectly," Robert explained. "We wait until the Tiger fires at something else, then move during its reload cycle. Gunner, once we're in position, you'll have one shot at the Tiger's side armor as it passes. Make it count." "What if it doesn't fire at something else?" Thompson asked. Robert took a deep breath. "Then we stay here until it finds us, or until reinforcements arrive." "Reinforcements?" Romano snorted. "What reinforcements?" "We're it, boss." Before Robert could respond, the sound of another engine approaching from behind them caught his attention. Through his periscope, he spotted a Sherman emerging from a side road about 200 yards to their rear. It was Anderson's tank, still operational and moving to join them. "Contact Anderson," Robert ordered their radio man, James Doc Miller. "Tell him to hold position and provide covering fire on the Panthers. We're going after the Tiger." Miller relayed the message, receiving a terse acknowledgement from Anderson's tank. The next few minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited for the right moment. The Tiger continued its methodical advance, now less than 500 yards away and closing. The four Panthers had spread out into a loose semicircle, sweeping the area for the remaining American tanks. Then it happened. Anderson's tank fired from its position, the shell striking one of the Panthers in the turret ring, where the armor was thinner. The German tank didn't explode, but its turret jammed, rendering it combat ineffective. The Tiger immediately swiveled its massive gun toward the new threat and fired. The shell missed Anderson's tank by a narrow margin, impacting the ground beside it and showering it with dirt and debris. "Now," Robert shouted, "go!" Wilson gunned the engine, and the Sherman burst from behind the stone barn, racing for the drainage ditch. The Tiger's crew, focused on Anderson, didn't immediately notice the movement. Thompson rotated their turret smoothly, tracking the Tiger as they moved. "Target acquired," he announced. "Range 300 and closing." "Wait for the shot," Robert cautioned. "We need to get closer and have a perfect angle on their side armor." The Tiger began to turn its turret back toward them, having spotted their movement. It was a race now. Could they reach their position and fire before the Tiger brought its devastating gun to bear on them? "Almost there," Wilson called, pushing the Sherman to its maximum speed. The drainage ditch appeared, and Wilson expertly slid the tank into position, the hull dropping down behind the earthen embankment, leaving only the turret exposed. They were now perpendicular to the Tiger's path, with a perfect shot at its vulnerable side armor as it passed. "On target," Thompson confirmed, his eye pressed to the gunner's sight. "Range 200 yards and holding." "Fire when ready," Robert ordered, his heart pounding in his chest. Thompson took a deep breath, made a final adjustment, and squeezed the trigger. The Sherman's gun roared once more, sending their precious HVAP round hurtling toward the Tiger's side. Time seemed to slow as Robert watched through his periscope. The shell struck the Tiger exactly where aimed, against the relatively thinner side armor just above the track. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small jet of flame erupted from the impact point. The Tiger slowed but didn't stop, its turret continuing to rotate toward them. "It's still operational," Robert announced. "Load another HVAP round." "Loading," Romano confirmed, swiftly ramming the second special shell into the breech. The Tiger's gun was now pointed directly at them. At this range, there would be no missing. "Fire!" Robert shouted, not waiting for Thompson to announce he was ready. The Sherman's gun roared again. This time, the HVAP round struck the Tiger's turret ring, penetrating the vulnerable point where the turret joined the hull. A larger explosion followed as ammunition inside the German tank began to cook off. The Tiger halted, smoke pouring from its hatches. For several seconds, nothing else happened. Then suddenly the commander's hatch opened, and a figure emerged, followed quickly by two more crew members escaping the burning vehicle. "Cease fire," Robert ordered. "They're bailing out." Through his periscope, he watched as the German tankers ran for the cover of a nearby hedgerow. One of them, presumably the commander, paused to look back at his destroyed tank before following his men to safety. The remaining Panthers, seeing their centerpiece destroyed, began to withdraw, using smoke grenades to cover their retreat. Anderson's tank fired a few more rounds at the fleeing Germans, but scored no additional hits. When the smoke cleared, the battlefield fell silent, except for the crackling flames consuming Captain Reynolds' tank and the Tiger. Of the 4 Shermans that had begun the engagement, only 2 remained operational. Radio division, Robert instructed Miller. Inform them that we've engaged and destroyed 1 Tiger and disabled 1 Panther. Request immediate recovery team for our casualties and reinforcements to hold this position. As Miller relayed the message, Robert opened his hatch and stood up in the turret, surveying the devastation around them. The Tiger burned fiercely about 200 yards away, occasional secondary explosions indicating ammunition still cooking off inside. It was his first tank-to-tank kill, a remarkable achievement against the most feared armored vehicle in the German arsenal. He should have felt triumphant, or at least relieved to have survived. Instead, he felt only a profound weariness and a deep sadness for the men who had died on both sides of the engagement. Later, after recovery teams had arrived to retrieve the bodies of Captain Reynolds and his crew, Robert approached the smoldering wreckage of the Tiger. Despite warnings about potential ammunition explosions, he needed to see up close the machine that had nearly killed him and had succeeded in killing his comrades. The Tiger was even more massive in person than it appeared in the recognition manuals. Standing beside it, Robert felt dwarfed by its size and power. The 88 mm gun, now pointed uselessly at the sky, was nearly twice the length of his Sherman 76 millers. Near the rear of the tank, something caught his eye, a small metal plate with identification markings. Using his combat knife, he pried off a piece of the armor plating that contained the Nazi eagle emblem and the vehicle's serial number, 250122. As he pocketed the souvenir, a movement in the nearby hedgerow caught his attention. Instinctively, his hand dropped to the Colt 45 on his hip. But the figure that emerged with hands raised was not a threat, an elderly French farmer, his face weathered by decades of working the Norman soil. "Americain?" the old man asked cautiously. Robert nodded. "Oui, Americain." The farmer approached slowly, looking with obvious disdain at the destroyed Tiger. "Le commandant," he said, pointing to the hedgerow where the German crew had disappeared. "Officier, parle français." He pantomimed writing something, then handed Robert a small, folded piece of paper. Robert opened it to find a message written in precise, educated French. He had studied enough of the language to make out the basic meaning. "To the American tank commander who bested us today. You fought with skill and honor. Perhaps in another time, we might have met as engineers rather than enemies. The fortunes of war have favored you today, but our paths may cross again. Until then, soldier to soldier, I salute your victory. Hauptmann Heinrich Wagner, 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion." Robert carefully folded the note and placed it in his breast pocket alongside the metal fragment from the Tiger. An unexpected gesture of respect from an enemy he had never seen face to face. That evening, sitting alone in the relative quiet of their bivouac area, Robert began his journal entry. June 27, 1944. Engaged and destroyed Tiger tank number 250122 near St. Lo. Lost Captain Reynolds and Lieutenant Peters with their entire crews. The Tiger was commanded by a Captain Wagner. His note suggests he is an engineer by training. Wonder if he helped design the very machine he commands. Tomorrow we advance towards St. Lo again, this time with reinforcements. They're calling our encounter the first successful Sherman versus Tiger engagement in our sector. Division commander is recommending me for a battlefield commission to lieutenant. I don't feel like a hero. Reynolds and Peters were good men. Their crews were good men. How many more will we lose before this is over? The piece of metal I took from the Tiger sits on my map case as I write this. A reminder that these monsters can be killed, but at what cost? Robert closed the journal and leaned back against the hull of his tank, exhausted yet unable to sleep. Above him, the stars emerged as the clouds finally cleared, the same stars that would be visible from Berlin, from London, from his hometown in Pennsylvania. The sound of approaching footsteps brought him back to the present. Lieutenant Anderson, now the senior officer of what remained of their platoon, stood before him with a flask extended. "Thought you could use this," Anderson said quietly. "Been saving it for a special occasion. Killing a Tiger qualifies." Robert accepted the flask and took a small sip, the whiskey burning a path down his throat. To Reynolds and Peters, he said, passing the flask back. To Reynolds and Peters, Anderson echoed before taking his own sip. And to the poor bastards in the next platoon of Shermans to face a tiger without the element of surprise. The two men sat in silence for a while, sharing the flask and the burden of survival. They're sending a replacement commander tomorrow, Anderson finally said. Major wants you to continue as tank commander rather than moving up to platoon leadership. Says you've got a gift for it. Robert nodded slowly. Fine by me. I know my crew. Trust them with my life. That tiger commander, Anderson said, nodding toward the note protruding from Robert's pocket. What did he say? Robert considered the question before answering. Said we got lucky today. Said our paths might cross again. Anderson snorted. Not if we blow up his next tank, too. But as Robert finally settled into an uneasy sleep that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that Hauptmann Heinrich Wagner had been right. Their paths would cross again before this war was over. The next time, luck might favor the other side. The tiger and its commander had entered his life, leaving an indelible mark that would shape the months to come in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The hunt had just begun. Now, 80 years later, Robert Mitchell stood in his Pennsylvania farmhouse, holding the same piece of metal and preparing to face the legacy of that first encounter. The tiger was waiting for him at Fort Knox, restored to its former glory, a museum piece rather than a weapon of war. And perhaps, somewhere in Germany, the descendants of Heinrich Wagner were about to receive a letter that should have been written decades ago. The time for silence had passed. The forgotten tiger hunter was about to tell his story. The flight from Philadelphia to Louisville gave Robert Mitchell more time alone with his thoughts than he had allowed himself in decades. Through the small oval window, he watched the American landscape unfold beneath him. The rolling Appalachian Mountains, the winding silver ribbons of rivers, the patchwork quilt of farmlands so different, yet so similar to the European countryside he had traversed in a Sherman tank 80 years earlier. The elderly woman beside him, perhaps a decade younger than his 78 years, had attempted conversation at the beginning of the flight. When Robert politely but firmly declined, choosing instead to stare out the window, she had settled into her magazine with a slight huff of disapproval. Robert hardly noticed. His mind was already in Germany, 1944, where the real journey had begun. After the initial encounter with Wagner's tiger near St. Lo, Robert's life had changed in ways he could never have anticipated. The unexpected destruction of the fearsome German tank had elevated him from an unremarkable tank commander to something of a minor celebrity within the American Armored Division. The battlefield commission to lieutenant had come through within days, followed by a silver star pinned to his chest by a general whose name he could no longer recall. But medals and promotions didn't change the fundamental equation of war. German tanks still outclassed American ones, and men still died in burning steel coffins. The difference was that now, Lieutenant Robert Mitchell was expected to teach others how to achieve what many considered a near miracle, destroying a Tiger tank with a Sherman. The memory of his first Tiger Killer lecture rose unbidden as the plane began its descent toward Louisville. August 1944, a makeshift classroom in a damaged French schoolhouse, maps and technical diagrams pinned to the walls, and 30 tank commanders looking at him with a mixture of respect, hope, and skepticism. The first thing you need to understand about the Tiger, he had told them, chalk dust coating his fingers as he sketched the distinctive silhouette of the German tank on the blackboard, is that it was designed to kill you from a distance you can't even see. Its 88mm gun can penetrate your armor at 2,000 yards. Your 76mm gun might penetrate its frontal armor at 200 yards, if you're lucky and hit the right spot. A captain in the back row had raised his hand. So what you're saying, Lieutenant, is that we're screwed. The room had erupted in nervous laughter, the kind that comes from men who already knew the odds they faced. What I'm saying, Robert had continued after the laughter subsided, is that you can't fight a tiger on its terms. You have to force it to fight on yours. The Tiger has 3 critical weaknesses. It's slow, it's heavy, and its side and rear armor are vulnerable. He had gone on to outline the tactics that had worked for him, using terrain to force the Tiger to expose its flanks, coordinating with multiple Shermans to attack from different angles, exploiting the Tiger's slow turret traverse and limited mobility in difficult terrain. What he hadn't shared was the note from Wagner, or the strange sense of connection he had felt with the German commander he had never seen face to face. Some things weren't meant for official reports or classroom discussions. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, pulling Robert back to the present. As he waited for the other passengers to gather their belongings and file slowly toward the exit, he found himself wondering if the lecture had saved any lives. If any of those tank commanders had faced a tiger and lived because of what he had taught them. If any had died despite it. Jason was waiting at the gate, his tall frame easy to spot above the crowd. At 35, he bore a striking resemblance to Robert's oldest son, Thomas. At the same age, the same sandy hair, now flecked with early gray at the temples, the same Mitchell jawline inherited through generations. But the eager enthusiasm in his eyes was all his own. "Grandpa," he called, waving unnecessarily. "Over here." Robert nodded in acknowledgement, making his way slowly but steadily through the terminal crowd. He carried only a small overnight bag, having long ago learned to travel light. "Let me take that," Jason offered, reaching for the bag as they met. Robert shook his head. "I've got it, not an invalid yet." But he allowed his grandson to guide him toward the exit, a hand lightly on his elbow as they navigated the busy airport. "How was the flight?" Jason asked. "Uneventful," Robert replied. "Best kind. Hotel's not far, about 20 minutes to Fort Knox from there." Jason was talking faster than usual, a sure sign of excitement. "The museum curator wants to meet you tonight if you're not too tired. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield. She's been leading the Tiger Restoration Project. Brilliant woman, specialized in World War II armored vehicles." Robert nodded, half listening as they approached the rental car. He found himself surveying the parking lot as if expecting to see German reconnaissance units hiding between the rows of identical vehicles. Old habits died hard, especially when awakened after decades of dormancy. "We don't have to do anything tonight if you're tired from the trip," Jason added, interpreting Robert's silence as fatigue. "We could just get dinner at the hotel and rest up for tomorrow." "I'd like to see it," Robert said quietly. "The tiger. Tonight, if possible." Jason's expression brightened. "Of course. I'll call Dr. Whitfield right away." The drive from the airport to the hotel passed in relative silence. Jason seemed to understand that his grandfather was processing something deeper than mere travel fatigue. He pointed out landmarks occasionally, a new stadium, an old bourbon distillery, but otherwise allowed Robert his thoughts. The hotel was one of those modern, anonymous structures that could have been in any city in America. Their rooms were adjacent on the 4th floor, with a connecting door that Jason had requested specifically. "In case you need anything during the night," he had explained, though both men knew it was more for Jason's peace of mind than Robert's convenience. After a brief rest and a change of clothes, Robert insisting on a proper button-down shirt and tie for his first meeting with the museum curator, they drove the short distance to Fort Knox. The military base had changed significantly since Robert's basic training days in 1943, but the entrance still carried the same sense of purpose and authority. The Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor sat near the main gate, its modern glass and steel architecture a stark contrast to the utilitarian military buildings surrounding it. As they pulled into the parking lot, Robert noticed a large tarpaulin-covered object in a cordoned-off area behind the museum. "Is that it?" he asked, nodding toward the shrouded shape. Jason followed his gaze. "Yes, they've set up a special pavilion for the unveiling ceremony. The tiger itself is still inside the restoration hangar. That's where we're headed." The museum was officially closed to the public, but a security guard was waiting at a side entrance. He checked Jason's credentials and then led them through dimly lit exhibition halls filled with tanks, artillery pieces, and other military vehicles from various conflicts. Robert found himself automatically identifying each piece: M4 Sherman, M26 Pershing, Soviet T-34 British Churchill. British. "This way, gentlemen," the guard said, stopping before a heavy door marked Restoration Area. Authorized personnel only. He swiped a key card and the door opened with a soft hiss. The restoration hangar was a cavernous space, brightly lit with industrial LEDs that created pools of harsh white light throughout the area. Several vintage vehicles in various states of repair were positioned around the periphery, but the center of the room was dominated by a single massive shape covered with a large canvas tarp. Standing beside it was a woman in her 50s, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore khaki pants and a blue work shirt with the museum's logo, and she was making notes on a tablet computer as they entered. "Dr. Whitfield," Jason called, "may I present my grandfather, Robert Mitchell?" The woman looked up, her expression transitioning quickly from mild annoyance at being interrupted to genuine interest. She set down her tablet and approached them, hand extended. "Lieutenant Mitchell," she said warmly, "it is an absolute honor to meet you. Your grandson has told me about your experiences with the tiger eye during the war." Robert shook her hand, noting the firm grip and calloused palm of someone who worked with tools as much as with books. "Just Mr. Mitchell these days, Doctor. It's been a long time since anyone called me Lieutenant." "Of course," she nodded. "Jason mentioned that you'd like to see our tiger tonight, ahead of tomorrow's technical inspection. I'm more than happy to accommodate that request." She led them towards the covered tank, speaking as they walked. "This particular tiger, as you may know, was captured near Castle in April 19 It was one of the few tigers taken relatively intact. The Americans shipped it back to Aberdeen Proving Ground for evaluation, then it spent decades in outdoor storage before being transferred to our museum in the 1990s. They stopped a few feet from the covered vehicle. Dr. Whitfield turned to face Robert directly. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand from your grandson that you may have encountered this specific tank during the war. Serial number 250122, is that correct?" Robert nodded slowly. "Yes, near Castle, April 10th, 1945. "Then this will be quite a reunion." She reached for a corner of the tarp. "Would you like to do the honors?" Robert hesitated, then stepped forward. His weathered hand closed around the rough canvas. With a single fluid motion that belied his age, he pulled the tarp back, revealing the front section of the Tiger. The massive angular hull, the distinctive overlapping wheel system, the long-barreled 88mm gun, all exactly as he remembered, yet somehow smaller than the behemoth that had occupied his nightmares for years after the war. The tank had been meticulously restored, its dark gray paint fresh, the black Iron Cross insignia crisp against the hull sides, the tactical number 232 stenciled in white on the turret. "We've restored it to its exact condition as of April 1945, Dr. Whitfield explained, watching Robert carefully. "Every detail is historically accurate based on extensive research and the vehicle's own evidence." Robert moved slowly around the front of the tank, his eyes taking in every detail. He reached out hesitantly, his fingertips just brushing the cold metal of the gun mantlet. "The armor here is 120 millimeters thick," he said quietly, as if to himself. "Nearly 5 inches of hardened steel. Our shells would just bounce off unless we hit it at exactly the right angle." Dr. Whitfield nodded. The frontal armor made it nearly impervious to most Allied tank guns of the period. That's what made the Tiger so formidable on the battlefield. Robert continued his circuit of the tank, stopping at the left side where the driver's viewport was located. "Wagner sat here," he said, his voice distant. "Hauptmann Heinrich Wagner." Our Whitfield's eyebrows rose slightly. "You knew the commander's name?" "He left me a note after our first encounter near St. Lo." Robert's fingers traced the outline of the viewport. "We disabled his tank, but he and most of his crew escaped. Left a message with a local farmer. Soldier to soldier. Said our paths would cross again." "And did they?" Jason asked, recording the conversation with a small handheld device. Robert nodded. "3 more times before Castle. It became something of a personal duel between us. Between our crews, between our machines." He moved to the rear of the tank, examining the engine compartment access panels. "Maybach HL 230 P45, V12 engine, 700 horsepower. Impressive power plant, but a fuel guzzler. 24 gallons to go 60 miles on roads, half that cross-country." Dr. Whitfield was watching him with undisguised fascination. "Mr. Mitchell, your knowledge of the Tiger's technical specifications is remarkable, especially after all these years." "When something's trying to kill you," Robert replied, "you tend to learn everything you can about it." He completed his circuit of the tank, returning to the front. For several long moments, he simply stood there, gazing at the machine that had played such a pivotal role in his life. Then, from his pocket, he withdrew the piece of metal with the Nazi eagle emblem. "I took this from Wagner's first Tiger after we disabled it near St. Lo," he said, holding it out for Dr. Whitfield to see. "Kept it as a souvenir, a reminder." "May I?" she asked, and when Robert nodded, she took the metal fragment carefully. "This is extraordinary. It matches perfectly with the manufacturing style of the Tiger Walleyes armor plating. This would be invaluable for our exhibit if you'd consider loaning it to us." Robert shook his head. "Not a loan, a donation. It belongs with the tank." Dr. Whitfield's expression was one of genuine gratitude. Thank you. We'll create a special display case for it, with full attribution to you, of course. No need for that, Robert said. Just put it with the tank. That's where it belongs. As they prepared to leave, Robert paused for one more look at the tiger. May I come back tomorrow, before the technical inspection? There are some things I'd like to check. Of course, Dr. Whitfield replied. The museum opens to staff at 7. I'll make sure security knows to expect you. As they walked back through the exhibition hall, past the silent sentinels of conflicts long concluded, Robert found himself more alert, more present than he had felt in years. The weight of the pound, carried for so long in silence, seemed lighter somehow now that it was being shared. That night, in his hotel room, Robert removed his old journal from the overnight bag and opened it to the entries from July 1944. The pages were brittle, the handwriting sharper and more urgent than his current measured script. He began to read, transporting himself back to the Norman countryside and the second encounter with Wagner and his tiger. July 15, 1944. The fields outside Carentan. The American advance had stalled against determined German resistance. Robert's platoon, now under the command of Captain Harris, a hard-bitten career officer with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and a talent for colorful profanity, was assigned to support an infantry push through a heavily wooded area believed to be lightly defended. Intelligence once again proved catastrophically wrong. "Contact front!" shouted Romano from the loader's position, his Brooklyn accent cutting through the engine noise. "Panzer, 11 o'clock, 800 yards. Robert, standing in the turret hatch for better visibility, swung his binoculars in the indicated direction. Through a gap in the trees, he could see the distinctive outline of a German tank moving slowly along a dirt road. "Identify," he ordered, though he already suspected what they were facing. Thompson, at the gunner's sight, responded immediately. "Tiger, same tactical markings as the one from St. Lo." Robert felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Wagner, it had to be. The German officer had acquired a new tank. "All tanks hold position," Captain Harris's voice crackled over the radio. "Mitchell, confirm identification." "Confirm Tiger, sir," Robert replied. "Tactical markings match the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion. It's moving west along the farm road. Doesn't appear to have spotted us yet." A pause, then. "Mitchell, your tank will advance to that stone farmhouse at grid reference Delta 53. The rest of the platoon will move to flanking positions here and here." The platoon map crackled with static as Harris indicated the positions. "We'll catch him in a crossfire." It was a solid plan, assuming the Tiger remained unaware of their presence until they were in position. But as Robert ordered Wilson to advance toward the farmhouse, a sense of unease settled in his stomach. Wagner had proven himself a canny opponent. The exposed position of the Tiger seemed almost deliberate. "Driver, maintain hull-down position behind this ridgeline," Robert instructed. "Advance slowly. I don't like this." Wilson complied, keeping the Sherman's hull concealed behind the gentle rise of land as they moved forward, only the turret visible to any observer ahead. The stone farmhouse was about 500 yards away, its walls partially collapsed from some previous fighting. "Sir," Thompson called from the gunner's position, "the Tiger has stopped. It's just sitting there in the open." Robert focused his binoculars on the German tank. Thompson was right. The Tiger had halted in the middle of the farm road, fully exposed, its long 88mm gun traversing slowly back and forth as if searching for targets. "It's a trap," Robert said softly. "Captain, this is Mitchell. I believe the Tiger is acting as bait. Request permission to hold position and observe." "Negative, Lieutenant," Harris replied immediately. "Continue to your assigned position. The rest of the platoon is almost in place." Robert hesitated. Direct disobedience of an order in combat could mean a court-martial, but the sense of wrongness was overwhelming. "All respect, sir, but something's not right. The Tiger commander knows what he's doing. He wouldn't expose himself like this unless—" A massive explosion cut off his transmission as the farmhouse he had been ordered to approach erupted in a cloud of dust and debris. A second Tiger, concealed behind the structure, had fired, the shell impacting the ground where Robert's tank would have been had they continued their advance. "Ambush!" Robert shouted, both into his crew intercom and the platoon radio. "Second Tiger behind the farmhouse. All tanks, hold position." The radio exploded with chatter as the platoon responded to the threat. Through his binoculars, Robert could now see the second Tiger emerging from behind the ruined farmhouse, while the first began to advance directly toward their position. "Sir, both Tigers have us bracketed," Robert reported to Harris. "Recommend immediate tactical withdrawal to the tree line at R6. We can use the forest for cover and re-engage from multiple angles. This time, Harris didn't argue. All tanks, fall back to the tree line. Maintain covering fire during withdrawal. As Wilson began to reverse the Sherman, keeping the hull behind the ridgeline, Robert surveyed the battlefield. The two Tigers were advancing methodically, one from the east, one from the north, attempting to catch the American tanks in a pincer movement. It was a textbook armored assault, executed with precision. They're hurting us, Robert realized aloud. Driver, belay that last order. Hard right, then proceed to that sunken road at 2 o'clock. We're not going where they expect. Sir, Wilson questioned, even as he began to turn the tank as instructed. Trust me, Robert said. Everyone else is retreating to the woods. They'll be waiting for that. We're going to flank the flankers. The Sherman's tracks churned up the soft earth as Wilson maneuvered them away from the ridgeline and toward a narrow sunken road that ran perpendicular to their original position. It was a risky move, exposing their flank briefly, but it worked. The Tigers, focused on the main American withdrawal, didn't immediately adjust to the single tank breaking from the formation. Gunner, traverse 180, be ready to engage the rear Tiger on my command, Robert ordered. Driver, once we reach the sunken road, proceed east until we're directly behind the enemy's position. The plan was audacious, perhaps even foolhardy, but it played to the Sherman's advantages: speed and maneuverability. While the massive Tigers advanced toward the American withdrawal, Robert's tank was circling behind them, using the terrain to remain concealed. The sunken road provided perfect concealment, its high banks hiding the Sherman from view as they moved parallel to the German advance. Through his periscope, Robert could occasionally glimpse the tops of the Tiger turrets above the rolling terrain. Range to rear Tiger? He asked Thompson. 600 yards in closing, the gunner replied. We'll have a shot at their rear armor once we clear this bend. Robert nodded, though Thompson couldn't see it. Load HVAP, he instructed Romano. Last one, the loader confirmed as he rammed the special shell into the breech. They had started the day with only 3 of the precious, high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, having used the other 2 in previous engagements. The Sherman cleared the bend in the sunken road, and suddenly they had a perfect view of the rearmost Tiger, its massive bulk presenting the vulnerable rear armor as it continued its advance away from them. Target acquired, Thompson announced, his voice steady despite the enormity of what they were attempting. Range 450 yards. Fire when ready, Robert ordered, knowing they would get only one shot before the Tiger became aware of their presence and responded. Thompson took a deep breath, made a final adjustment to his sight, and squeezed the trigger. The Sherman's 76mm gun roared, the shell streaking toward the unsuspecting Tiger. The HVAP round struck exactly where aimed, penetrating the thinner rear armor of the German tank. A moment later, a secondary explosion blossomed from within as ammunition ignited, the Tiger's turret lifting slightly before settling back at an awkward angle. Direct hit, Romano shouted. We got the bastard. Driver, reverse, maximum speed, Robert ordered immediately, even as he reported the kill to Captain Harris. The second Tiger would surely respond to the destruction of its partner, and they needed to be elsewhere when that happened. Wilson threw the Sherman into reverse, backing rapidly down the sunken road they had just traversed. They had barely covered 100 yards when the distinctive crack of the 88mm gun echoed across the battlefield, and a shell impacted the bank of the sunken road just ahead of their position, showering the tank with dirt and debris. The other Tiger has spotted us, Robert announced unnecessarily. Driver, continue reverse until we reach that crossroads, then hard left toward the woods. The radio crackled with Captain Harris's voice. Mitchell, what's your situation? One Tiger destroyed, sir. The second has us under fire. We're withdrawing to the wood line to rejoin the platoon. Negative. Maintain separation. We've got the second Tiger engaged from the tree line. Your movement is pulling its attention, giving our other tanks clear shots at its flank. Robert understood immediately. His tank was serving as a diversion, drawing the Tiger's fire while the rest of the platoon maneuvered for killing shots. It was sound tactics, but it placed his crew in the direct line of fire from the most powerful tank gun in the European theater. Acknowledged, sir, he replied, suppressing the urge to point out that being Tiger bait had not been part of the original plan. We'll continue to draw its fire. The second Tiger was now in full pursuit, having abandoned its original objective to chase the tank that had destroyed its partner. It was exactly what Harris wanted, but it placed Robert's Sherman in extreme danger. Driver, once we clear the sunken road, or some Sherman road, Head for that cluster of farm buildings to the southwest. We need more substantial cover than the woods. Another 88mm shell screamed overhead, missing them by mere yards. The Tiger was finding its range. "It's getting closer," Wilson called, pushing the Sherman to its maximum reverse speed. "Almost to the crossroads," Robert assured him. "Get ready for that hard left." The crossroads appeared, and Wilson executed a perfect pivot, turning the tank 90 degrees before shifting into forward gear and accelerating toward the distant farm buildings. The Tiger, slowed by its weight and inferior maneuverability, took longer to adjust course, giving them a brief advantage. "Sir," Miller called from the radio operator's position. "Captain Harris reports multiple hits on the Tiger's flank, but no penetration. They're requesting we lead it past their position for rear shots." Robert quickly assessed the situation. The farm buildings were in the opposite direction from the wood line where the rest of the platoon waited. Leading the Tiger toward them would mean turning back toward the pursuing behemoth. "Understood," he replied, already formulating a plan. "Driver, new course. Once we reach that hedgerow ahead, turn hard right and proceed directly toward the wood line at maximum speed." "That'll put us broadside to the Tiger," Wilson protested. "Only for a moment," Robert assured him. "Its turret traverse can't keep up with our turn rate if we time it right. We'll be moving perpendicular to its firing solution." It was a gamble, but one based on Robert's growing understanding of the Tiger's capabilities and limitations. The German tank was formidable, but it was also complex and mechanical. It operated according to physics and engineering principles, not magic. As they approached the hedgerow, Robert opened the turret hatch for better visibility, ignoring the safety protocols that demanded he remain buttoned up under fire. He needed to see this with his own eyes, to time it perfectly. The Tiger was about 300 yards behind them, its 88mm gun tracking their movement. As they reached the hedgerow, Robert shouted, "Now, hard right!" Wilson spun the wheel, and the Sherman pivoted sharply, its tracks throwing mud and vegetation as it turned 90 degrees and accelerated toward the distant tree line where the rest of the platoon waited. The Tiger fired, but the shell passed harmlessly behind them, the German gunner unable to adjust quickly enough to the sudden change in direction. By the time the Tiger's turret completed its traverse to track them, the Sherman was already at maximum speed, presenting a much more difficult target. Through his binoculars, Robert could see movement at the edge of the wood line, the other Shermans of his platoon repositioning for clear shots as the Tiger pursued him directly toward their position. "Almost there," he encouraged his crew. "Another 30 seconds and we'll have that Tiger right where we want it." The distance to the wood line closed rapidly as the Sherman raced across the open field, the Tiger following determinedly but falling gradually behind due to its lower speed. Robert had timed it perfectly. They would reach the protective cover of the trees with the Tiger still in the open, exposed to the guns of the entire platoon. "All tanks, prepare to engage," Captain Harris's voice came over the radio. "Mitchell, once you clear the tree line, hard right again. That'll give everyone clear shots." Robert acknowledged the order and relayed the instructions to Wilson. As they approached the trees, he took one last look behind them at the pursuing Tiger. Through his binoculars, he could see the tank commander standing in the open turret hatch, binoculars raised. Wagner, it had to be. For a brief, surreal moment, Robert wondered if the German officer was looking directly at him, if their eyes might be meeting across the battlefield through the magnifying lenses of their respective binoculars. Then the moment passed as the Sherman plunged into the relative darkness of the forest, branches whipping against the hull as Wilson navigated between the trees. "Hard right now," Robert ordered once they were about 50 yards into the wood line. Wilson complied, turning the tank parallel to the forest edge as the other Shermans of the platoon opened fire on the Tiger, which was now framed perfectly in the open field. 4 76mm guns fired almost simultaneously, the shells streaking toward the German tank. 2 missed, one deflected off the angled frontal armor, but the fourth struck the junction between the turret and the hull, penetrating the weaker armor there. The Tiger didn't explode as the first one had. Instead, it simply stopped, smoke pouring from the engine compartment in the open turret hatch. Through the trees, Robert watched as 4 crew members bailed out, the distinctive figure of the commander last to emerge, pausing atop the turret to survey the battlefield before jumping down. "Cease fire," Captain Harris ordered over the radio. "The crew is surrendering." But even as Harris spoke, the German tankers disappeared into a nearby hedgerow, evading capture. It was a scenario Robert had seen before and would see again. The highly trained Tiger crews were too valuable to the German war effort to be captured. They would escape back to their lines, acquire new tanks, and return to battle. Later that evening, as the platoon established its bivouac several miles from the engagement area, Captain Harris approached Robert as he performed maintenance checks on Mustang Sally. "That was either the bravest or the most foolhardy thing I've seen in this war," Harris said without preamble. "Breaking formation, flanking a Tiger alone, then playing bait. You could have gotten yourself and your crew killed." Robert straightened up from where he had been inspecting the track. Attention. "Yes, sir. But we didn't. We destroyed one Tiger and helped disable another." Harris studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Write it up for the combat report. Division's going to want every detail of how you managed to take out a Tiger from behind." He turned to leave, then paused. "That German tank commander, the one that got away. You think it was the same one from your first engagement?" Robert nodded. "Wagner, Hauptmann Heinrich Wagner, 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion. I'm sure of it." Harris frowned. "How do you know his name?" Robert reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the folded note from their first encounter, now worn from being carried continuously. He handed it to Harris, who read it with raised eyebrows. "Perhaps in another time we might have met as engineers rather than enemies," Harris read aloud. "Sounds like this Wagner fellow has a romantic streak." He handed the note back. "Or maybe he's just trying to get in your head." "Maybe," Robert conceded. "But he's good, sir, very good. He set that ambush perfectly. If we'd followed the original plan, we'd have lost half the platoon." Harris grunted in acknowledgement. "Well, let's hope we don't run into him again. But if we do..." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Next time, they needed to capture or kill the German officer, not just disable his tank. The memory faded as Robert closed the journal, the hotel room coming back into focus around him. The second encounter with Wagner had established a pattern that would repeat itself twice more before the final confrontation at Kassel. Mutual respect between adversaries, a chess game played with steel monsters across the battlefields of Europe. Robert carefully placed the journal on the nightstand and turned out the light. Tomorrow he would examine the Tiger more thoroughly, looking for the specific details that only someone who had faced it in combat would know. And perhaps, in the process, he would find the answers to questions that had haunted him for 8 decades. Sleep came more easily than he had expected. His dreams for once not filled with burning tanks and dying comrades, but with the image of an elderly German man sitting in a similar hotel room in Stuttgart, perhaps also remembering their shared past. The next morning, Robert was waiting at the museum entrance when Dr. Whitfield arrived at precisely 7 o'clock. She seemed unsurprised to find him there, dressed in the same formal shirt and tie he had worn the previous evening. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," she greeted him. "You're certainly punctual." "Old habits," he replied simply. She led him through the quiet museum, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. "The technical inspection team won't arrive until 9, she explained. "So you'll have about 2 hours with the Tiger, if that's sufficient." Robert nodded. "More than enough." When they reached the restoration hangar, the Tiger sat uncovered in the center, bathed in the harsh LED lighting. Dr. Whitfield switched on additional lights, illuminating every detail of the massive tank. "I'll be in my office if you need anything," she offered. "Just press that intercom button by the door." Robert thanked her, and then he was alone with the machine that had shaped so much of his life. He approached it slowly, circling it once just as he had the previous evening, reacquainting himself with its dimensions and features. Then from his pocket, he withdrew a small notebook and pencil. He had come prepared to document specific details, things that only someone who had faced this particular Tiger in combat might know. The manufacturing serial number was visible on a plate near the rear of the hull, 250122, confirming what he already knew. But there were other, more subtle identifiers he sought. Near the driver's viewport, he found what he was looking for, a small dent in the armor, barely noticeable unless one knew exactly where to look. It had been caused by a 76mm shell from Lieutenant Anderson's tank during their third encounter with Wagner in the Ardennes, during what later became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Robert made a careful sketch of the dent's location and dimensions in his notebook. Then he moved to the rear of the tank, examining the engine access panels. There, on the left panel, he found another telltale mark, a welded repair where shrapnel from an American artillery shell had penetrated the thinner rear armor. That had been from their fourth encounter, near the Rhine crossing in March 1945. He continued his methodical examination, documenting each unique feature that confirmed this was indeed Wagner's final Tiger. The specific wear pattern on the drive sprockets, the particular arrangement of tools and spare track links on the hull sides, the distinctive weld seam where a section of track guard had been repaired after damage. After about an hour, Robert had filled several pages with notes and sketches. He was confident beyond any doubt that this was the same Tiger he had faced in their final encounter near Castle, the same machine that had nearly killed him and had succeeded in killing Hank Wilson, his driver since Normandy. As he closed his notebook, Robert became aware that he was no longer alone. Dr. Whitfield had returned and was standing quietly near the entrance, observing him. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked, approaching now that she had been noticed. Robert nodded. "This is definitely Wagner's Tiger from Castle. I've documented several identifying features that match my recollections and journal entries." "That's extraordinary," Dr. Whitfield said. "Would you be willing to share your notes? They would be invaluable for our historical documentation." "Of course." Robert handed her the notebook. "These marks here and here," he indicated the specific locations on the tank, "are from previous encounters between his tank and my platoon. This dent near the driver's viewport is from the Ardennes, December 44. This repaired section at the rear is from the Rhine crossing, March 45. Dr. Whitfield was taking photographs with her tablet as Robert pointed out each feature. "This is the kind of detailed provenance that historians dream of," she said. "First-hand confirmation of the vehicle's combat history." Robert continued around the tank, pointing out additional details. "The commander's cupola has been replaced," he noted. "The original was damaged during the Ardennes fighting. You can see the slightly different manufacturing style of the replacement." "Remarkable," Dr. Whitfield murmured, documenting each observation. "Mr. Mitchell, would you be willing to record an oral history interview about your experiences? It would be an invaluable addition to our archives." Robert hesitated. He had come prepared to examine the tank, perhaps share some basic technical information. But a comprehensive oral history would mean reliving everything, including the final battle that had haunted his dreams for decades. "I'll consider it," he finally said. "But first I'd like to ask a question." "Of course. How much do you know about Hauptmann Heinrich Wagner?" Dr. Whitfield's expression showed surprise. "The Tiger's commander? Very little, I'm afraid. We have the basic service record. Born in Stuttgart in 1914, joined in the Wehrmacht in 1939, assigned to the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion in early 1944, survived the war, died in 1987. That's about all we have." "He was an engineer before the war," Robert said quietly. "Worked for Mercedes-Benz, helped design automotive transmissions. After the war, he returned to engineering, eventually consulting on NATO's standardization of tank components in the 1950s. Dr. Whitfield stared at him. "How do you know all this?" Robert met her gaze steadily. "Because Heinrich Wagner and I corresponded for 40 years after the war, from 1947 until his death in 1987. The revelation hung in the air between them. Dr. Whitfield opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly processing the implications of what Robert had just shared. "You were in contact with the commander of the Tiger you faced in combat?" she finally asked. "For 4 decades?" Robert nodded. "It began with a letter he sent through the Red Cross in 1947. He wanted to know if I had survived the war. I was surprised, but I responded. Then he wrote back. And so it continued, a letter or two each year." "Do you still have these letters?" Dr. Whitfield asked, her professional interest clearly piqued. "Every one," Robert confirmed, "along with copies of my responses. They're in a safe deposit box back in Pennsylvania. I've never shown them to anyone. Not even my wife knew about them." "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Whitfield said carefully, "those letters would be of immense historical value. A 4-decade correspondence between former adversaries, both tank commanders. It's unprecedented in my experience." Robert had anticipated this reaction. "I didn't come here to discuss the letters, Dr. Whitfield. I came to see the Tiger and confirm that it was indeed Wagner's final tank, which it is." "Of course," she nodded, respecting his boundaries. "But may I ask why you kept this correspondence secret all these years?" Robert turned back to the Tiger, resting his hand on the cold metal of the hull. "Because some things are personal, even in war, especially after it." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Wagner and I were never friends, not in the conventional sense. But we shared something that no one else could understand. We both commanded machines designed to kill, and we both carried the burden of those we lost under our command. Dr. Whitfield nodded slowly. I understand, and I respect your privacy, but if you ever decide to share those letters, they would provide invaluable insight into the human dimension of mechanized warfare. Perhaps someday, Robert allowed, but not today. The sound of voices and footsteps approaching from the museum interrupted their conversation. The technical inspection team had arrived earlier than expected. Mr. Mitchell, Dr. Whitfield said quickly, would you be willing to stay for the inspection? Your first-hand knowledge would be extremely valuable to the team. Robert considered the request briefly, then nodded. I'll stay, but there's something I need to check first, if you don't mind. Of course. Robert moved to the left side of the Tiger, near the driver's position. Kneeling with some difficulty, he examined the lower hull where it joined the track assembly. After a moment of searching, he found what he was looking for, a small, irregular hole in the armor, about the size of a quarter, nearly hidden by the overlapping road wheel. This is it, he said softly. This is where the final shell penetrated. Dr. Whitfield joined him, crouching to see the damage. Your shot? She asked. Robert shook his head. No, Lieutenant Anderson's. My tank was already disabled by then. Anderson made the shot that ended it, that forced Wagner and his crew to abandon the Tiger. He straightened up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. That's the last piece of confirmation I needed. This is definitely Wagner's Tiger from Castle. The morning of the unveiling ceremony dawned clear and crisp, the Kentucky spring bringing a freshness to the air that reminded Robert Mitchell of another April morning 80 years earlier. He stood before the mirror in his hotel room, adjusting his tie with fingers that moved more deliberately than they once had, but were still capable of precision. The face that looked back at him bore the etchings of nearly 8 decades since the war. Deep lines around the eyes and mouth, skin weathered by years working his Pennsylvania farm, white hair neatly combed in the same style he had maintained since his Army days. For this day, he had chosen to wear his decorations, the Silver Star, the 3 Purple Hearts, the campaign medals that had spent most of the past 70 years in their boxes. They felt strange on his chest, like artifacts from another man's life. In many ways, they were. A soft knock at the connecting door announced Jason's arrival. His grandson entered, already dressed in a dark suit appropriate for the ceremony, his camera equipment packed in a professional case. You ready, Grandpa? Jason asked, his voice gentle with understanding. This wasn't just another filming assignment for him. It was family history. Robert nodded, reaching for his walking cane. As ready as I'll ever be. The drive to Fort Knox was quieter than previous days. Robert sat in the passenger seat, gazing out at the rolling Kentucky landscape, but seeing instead the hills of central Germany as they had appeared from the commander's hatch of a Sherman tank in April 1945. The war was nearly over then. Hitler would be dead in his Berlin bunker within weeks. But for the men on the front lines, each day remained as dangerous as any that had come before. You sure you're up for this? Jason asked as they approached the base entrance. It's going to be a long day. I didn't come this far to back out now, Robert replied. Besides, there are some things that need to be said while there's still someone left to say them. The museum grounds had been transformed overnight. A large pavilion stood erected in the open area behind the main building, white canvas sides billowing slightly in the morning breeze. Rows of folding chairs faced a raised platform where the Tiger Y tank now sat, still covered with a large tarp but clearly recognizable by its distinctive silhouette. Media equipment, cameras, and lighting rigs surrounded the platform, evidence of the event's significance to military historians and enthusiasts. A small crowd had already gathered despite the early hour. Museum staff, military personnel in dress uniforms, reporters, and camera crews. Dr. Whitfield spotted them as they parked and hurried over, her professional demeanor not quite masking her excitement. Mr. Mitchell, she greeted, we've reserved a special seat for you in the front row. The ceremony begins at 10, but before that, I wondered if you might be willing to examine something we found last night during the final preparation of the Tiger. Robert raised an eyebrow questioningly. The restoration team was doing a final inspection of the interior, Dr. Whitfield explained, and they discovered something wedged beneath the commander's seat. Something that may have belonged to Hauptmann Wagner. Interest piqued, Robert followed her through a side entrance of the museum, Jason trailing behind with his camera. They bypassed the main exhibition hall and entered a small conference room where several preservation specialists in white gloves stood around a table. On the table lay a small, leather-bound book, its cover darkened with age and what appeared to be old stains. "A diary?" Robert asked, approaching slowly. Dr. Whitfield nodded. "We believe so. It's in German and the handwriting matches known examples of Wagner's. It seems to be a personal log he kept, separate from the official war diary required of all German officers." One of the specialists carefully opened the book to a page that had been marked with an acid-free paper tab. This entry is dated April 9th, 1945, the day before the final engagement near Kassel. Dr. Whitfield glanced at Robert. "None of us can read German well enough to translate it properly. We were hoping that I might," Robert finished for her. During their 40 years of correspondence, Wagner had written primarily in English, but occasionally lapsed into German for concepts that didn't translate well. Over time, Robert had learned enough of the language to comprehend it. He leaned forward, squinting slightly at the faded handwriting. The German words, written in a precise hand despite the circumstances under which they must have been recorded, swam into focus. "Tomorrow we move toward Kassel. Fuel is critically low, perhaps enough for 50 kilometers if we are fortunate. The division exists now only on paper. Of the original 45 Tigers, only mine and Mueller's remain operational, and his has a damaged gun that can no longer be repaired. The men know the war is lost. I know it too. Yet we continue because that is our duty. Intelligence reports American armor moving in our sector. 2nd Armored Division, Mitchell's unit. After 3 encounters, I have come to know his tactics as he has come to know mine. It has become something like a chess match between us, though one played with steel and lives rather than wooden pieces. If we meet again, one of us will not survive. This I know with certainty. There is a strange comfort in facing an adversary of skill and honor. If I am to die in this insanity, let it be against a worthy opponent." Robert straightened, his expression unreadable. "He knew we were coming," he said softly. "He was expecting us." "You understand it?" Dr. Whitfield asked. Robert nodded. "Well enough. It's his personal thoughts the day before our final engagement." He paused, choosing his words carefully. He knew the war was lost, knew his situation was hopeless, but he was still going to do his duty. "Just as you were," Jason observed. "Yes," Robert agreed, "just as I was." Dr. Whitfield gestured to one of the specialists, who carefully turned to another marked page. "There's one more entry, the last one, dated April 10th, 1945. Robert leaned forwards again, but this entry was shorter, the handwriting more hurried. "Mitchell found us. Clever maneuver through the valley. My driver is dead. Tank disabled. We are abandoning. No time for more." The abrupt end of the diary hung in the air like an unfinished sentence. Robert stared at the page, seeing not the faded ink, but the smoke-filled valley near Kassel, where the final confrontation had played out. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the book. With careful hands, the specialist slid the diary closer to him. Robert slowly turned back several pages, scanning entries from the preceding weeks. His German wasn't fluent, but he could make out enough to piece together Wagner's final campaign. A fighting retreat across Germany, fuel and ammunition dwindling, comrades lost in each engagement, yet still maintaining discipline and purpose even as the Third Reich collapsed around them. "He was a soldier," Robert said finally, stepping back from the table. "Not a Nazi ideologue, just a soldier doing what he believed was his duty." "Like so many on both sides," Dr. Whitfield agreed. "We'd like to include this diary in the Tiger exhibition with translations of key entries. Would you be willing to help with that once the ceremony is concluded?" Robert nodded. "Yes, I think I owe him that much." The find had added an unexpected dimension to the day, bringing Wagner's presence into the proceedings more vividly than Robert had anticipated. As they made their way to the pavilion for the ceremony, he found himself thinking not just of the machine they were about to unveil, but of the men who had crewed it, especially its commander, the engineer-turned-soldier who had become his counterpart in a deadly duel across the battlefields of Europe. The pavilion was now filled to capacity, with perhaps 200 people seated and more standing along the sides. Military personnel, historians, media representatives, and tank enthusiasts had come from across the country and even overseas for this unveiling. Robert recognized the distinctive uniform of a Bundeswehr officer, modern Germany's military, seated in the second row. As Dr. Whitfield had promised, a chair had been reserved for him in the center of the front row. Jason took a position to the side with the other photographers and videographers, his camera already capturing the scene. Robert settled into his seat, placing his cane beside him, his back straight despite his years. Once a soldier, always a soldier. The ceremony began with the formal protocols, the presentation of colors, the playing of both the American and German national anthems, a touch Robert found unexpectedly moving, and introductory remarks from the museum director about the historical significance of the Tiger Warmer tank in military technology. Then Dr. Whitfield took the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, the Tiger I tank we unveil today is more than just a rare artifact of World War II. It is a witness to history, a participant in some of the most significant armored engagements of the European theater. But machines do not fight wars. People do. And we are extraordinarily fortunate to have with us today a man who faced this very tiger in combat, Lieutenant Robert Mitchell of the United States 2nd Armored Division. A murmur rippled through the audience as all eyes turned toward Robert. De Whitfield continued, Lieutenant Mitchell's Sherman tank engaged this tiger on multiple occasions between June 1944 and April 1945, culminating in their final encounter near Kassel, Germany. It is my great honor to invite him to share his perspective on this remarkable vehicle and the men who fought both in it and against it. A round of applause filled the pavilion as Robert rose slowly to his feet, leaving his cane behind as he made his way to the podium with careful, measured steps. He had not prepared formal remarks, trusting instead in the clarity that often comes with great age, the ability to distinguish what truly matters from what does not. He gazed out at the sea of faces, then at the shrouded tiger looming behind him on the platform. For a moment, he was struck by the surreality of it all. Standing here 80 years later, an old man addressing a crowd about a war machine that had once tried to kill him. Thank you, he began, his voice stronger than many might have expected from a man his age. I'm not a historian or a technical expert. I was just a farm boy from Pennsylvania who found himself commanding a Sherman tank across Europe. But I did encounter this tiger and its commander, Hauptmann Heinrich Wagner, on 4 separate occasions before our final engagement near Kassel. Robert paused, gathering his thoughts. Much has been written about the technical superiority of the Tiger over the Sherman. Its thicker armor, its more powerful gun, its optical sighting system that allowed for accurate fire at ranges our tanks couldn't match. All of that is true. But war isn't just about technical specifications. It's about the men inside the machines, about terrain and tactics, about luck and determination. He turned slightly to gesture toward the covered tiger. This tank was formidable, no question. The first time my crew encountered it near St. Lo in June 1944, we survived only through a combination of good terrain usage, coordinated tactics with other tanks in our platoon, and yes, a healthy dose of luck. We learned quickly that you couldn't fight a tiger on its terms. You had to make it fight on yours. Robert's eyes scanned the audience, noting with satisfaction that they were listening intently, not checking watches or phones. But what I want to speak about today isn't just the tank itself, but something that often gets lost in the technical discussions and the battle analyses. I want to talk about respect between adversaries. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. After our first encounter, when we had disabled Wagner's Tiger, but he and most of his crew escaped, he left me a note delivered by a French farmer. It said in part, to the American tank commander who bested us today, you fought with skill and honor. Perhaps in another time, we might have met as engineers rather than enemies. Robert carefully refolded the note and returned it to his pocket. That began something unusual, a kind of long-distance dialogue between adversaries that would continue through 3 more encounters across France, Belgium, and finally Germany. Wagner was an engineer before the war, as was I in my studies before being drafted. We shared a technical appreciation for the machines we commanded, even as we used them to try to destroy each other. He paused, noticing the Bundeswehr officer leaning forward in his seat, listening with particular intensity. Yesterday, museum staff discovered Wagner's personal diary, hidden inside this very tiger for 80 years. In it, he wrote about our encounters, about the chess match between us. Even as the Third Reich was collapsing around him, even as he knew the war was lost, he maintained his professional bearing and his sense of duty. He was, above all, a soldier. Robert turned toward the shrouded tiger again. This machine has been restored to its 1945 condition. But I hope that as you view it, you'll remember that it was operated by human beings, men with families, with hopes, with fears, not so different from the Americans who fought against them. That understanding doesn't diminish the necessity of the Allied cause or excuse the regime they served, but it does acknowledge our shared humanity, even in humanity's darkest hour. He straightened his shoulders, his voice gaining strength. I am quite possibly the last living person to have faced a tiger eye in combat. When I'm gone, there will be no one left who can tell you what it was like to see that long 88mm gun swinging toward your position, to hear the distinctive sound of its engine, to feel the ground shake as its 56 tons moved across the battlefield. But the lessons of that experience remain. That courage can be found on both sides of a conflict, that respect can exist even between enemies, and that in the end, war is not about machines, but about the people who make them, operate them, and die in them. Robert nodded to the audience. Thank you for allowing an old soldier to share these memories. May we learn from them, even as we hope never to repeat the circumstances that created them. As he stepped away from the podium, the pavilion erupted in applause. Not the polite acknowledgement of a ceremonial speaker, but the genuine appreciation of an audience deeply moved. Jason caught his eye from the photographer's area, giving him a thumbs up as he continued filming. Dr. Whitfield returned to the podium, visibly affected by Robert's words. Thank you, Lieutenant Mitchell, for that powerful perspective. She composed herself and continued. And now the moment we've all been waiting for. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Tiger Wars number 25022 of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion. At her signal, museum staff pulled cords that released the tarp, revealing the fully restored Tiger in all its formidable glory. The dark gray paint gleamed under the pavilion lights, the black crosses on its sides stark against the metal, the long 88mm gun projecting an aura of deadly purpose even in stillness. A collective murmur of appreciation swept through the crowd. For many, this was their first time seeing one of these legendary machines in person. Robert remained standing to the side of the podium, his eyes fixed on the Tiger. In that moment, the decades fell away, and he was once again a young lieutenant, facing this behemoth across a smoke-filled battlefield. He could almost hear the thunder of its engine, the crack of its main gun, the shouted orders inside his own Sherman. After allowing the audience a few minutes to absorb the sight, Dr. Whitfield spoke again. As part of this permanent exhibition, we are honored to include several items of unique historical significance. The first is a piece of armor plating from this very Tiger, taken by Lieutenant Mitchell after their first encounter near St. Lo and generously donated back to the museum. She gestured to a small display case near the tank's front, where Robert's metal fragment was now prominently featured. The second is Hauptmann Wagner's personal diary, discovered just yesterday, which provides invaluable insights into the final days of the German armored forces in 1945. The ceremony continued with technical presentations about the restoration process and the Tiger's historical significance, but Robert found his attention drifting. His thoughts returned to April 10, 1945, to the valley near Kassel where he had faced Wagner for the final time. The memory was still vivid, not dimmed but rather crystallized by the passing decades. April 10, 1945. The 2nd Armored Division was pushing eastward, encountering pockets of determined German resistance despite the Reich's imminent collapse. Robert's platoon, now commanded by Major Lewis following Captain Harris's death during the Rhine crossing, had been assigned to probe a valley southwest of Kassel, believed to be lightly defended. They had learned to be skeptical of intelligence reports. Robert stood in the commander's hatch of Mustang Sally, binoculars scanning the rolling terrain ahead. The valley was beautiful in the spring morning light, with fresh green growth on the trees and wildflowers dotting the meadows. It seemed peaceful, belying the violence that had swept across Germany in recent months. The Sherman's radio crackled with Major Lewis's voice. All tanks hold position. Aerial reconnaissance reports possible armor in the tree line at grid coordinate Baker 6. Robert swung his binoculars toward the indicated position, a dense patch of woods about 1,000 yards ahead. At first, he saw nothing. Then a subtle movement caught his eye, a slight shifting of shadows that didn't match the natural movement of branches in the breeze. Mitchell here, he reported. I have possible visual at Baker 6. Request permission to advance with 2 tanks for closer observation. There was a pause before Lewis responded. Granted, take Anderson's tank as support. Approach to within 500 yards, no closer. The rest of the platoon will provide covering fire if needed. Acknowledged, Robert replied, then switched to the tank intercom. Driver, advance slowly. Gunner, keep the turret oriented toward that tree line. Loader, have an AP round ready. The familiar voices of his crew responded immediately. Wilson at the driver's position, Thompson as gunner, Romano as loader, and Miller on the radio. They had been together since Normandy, nearly a year now, developing the wordless understanding that came from facing death as a unit multiple times. The Sherman moved forward cautiously, tracks clanking on the hard-packed dirt road. Anderson's tank followed 50 yards to their right, maintaining the proper interval for mutual support. The morning was quiet except for the rumble of their engines and the distant calls of birds, creating an almost surreal contrast to their combat mission. As they approached the 700-yard mark, Robert noticed fresh track marks in the soft ground beside the road, wide, distinctive impressions that could only have been made by a very heavy vehicle. "Driver, halt," he ordered. "Those are tiger tracks, fresh ones." Wilson stopped the Sherman immediately. Robert studied the tracks through his binoculars, noting their direction, parallel to their current position, heading toward a small ridgeline to the east. "He's not in those woods," Robert realized aloud. "He's circling around to the high ground. It's Wagner. Has to be." "How can you be sure, sir?" Miller asked from the radio position. "Because it's what I would do," Robert replied. "Radio Anderson, tell him to maintain position and keep his gun on those woods as a diversion. We're going to loop around through that draw to our left and catch him on the move." As Miller relayed the instructions, Robert felt a familiar tension building in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the heightened awareness that came with knowing a deadly opponent was nearby. Over their previous encounters, he had developed an almost intuitive sense for Wagner's tactics, just as he suspected Wagner had for his. It had indeed become something like a chess match, with the stakes being the lives of their respective crews. "Driver, proceed into that draw at 9 o'clock, Robert instructed. "Keep our profile below the ridgeline. Gunner, traverse the turret to 3 o'clock and be ready for a snapshot if we crest and find him there." The Sherman turned off the road and descended into a shallow depression that ran roughly perpendicular to the suspected path of the tiger. The ground was softer here, muddied by recent rains, causing the tank to slow as its tracks sought purchase. "Steady," Robert cautioned Wilson. "No need to rush. Slow and quiet wins this game." For several minutes, they proceeded cautiously through the draw, the walls of earth on either side providing concealment, but also limiting their visibility. Robert alternated between watching the path ahead and checking their intended exit point, where they would crest the far side of the depression and hopefully catch the tiger in its flank. 200 yards to the exit point, Robert informed the crew. "Everyone ready. This is going to happen fast if it happens at all." A chorus of affirmations came through the intercom. These men had faced tigers before. They knew the drill. Get close, aim for the vulnerable points, fire first, and pray. 100 yards, Robert counted down. "Gunner, be ready to traverse instantly when we crest. Driver, give us just enough elevation to shoot, not enough to fully expose us." The Sherman continued its approach to the ridgeline. Through his periscope, Robert could see the crest coming up. Just a few more yards and they would have line of sight to the area where he expected the tiger to be moving. 50 yards, he said. "Steady." The crack of a heavy gun shattered the morning calm. Not the tiger's 88mm, but something equally powerful. An explosion erupted in the draw just ahead of them, sending dirt and debris showering over the Sherman. "Artillery," Robert shouted. "Driver, back up! Back up now!" Wilson threw the tank into reverse, the engine roaring as they retreated from the impact zone. A second shell landed where they had been moments before, confirming Robert's suspicion. They had been spotted and were now under fire from German artillery, likely called in by forward observers. "Sir," Miller called from the radio, "Major Lewis reports multiple artillery pieces active on the ridgeline to our northeast. The entire valley is a kill zone. They're ordering immediate withdrawal." Robert processed this information rapidly. Artillery meant the Germans had prepared a defensive position. This wasn't just a lone tiger or a small rearguard action. It was an ambush designed to draw in American armor and destroy it with plunging fire from the heights. "Understood," he replied. "Driver, continue reverse course back to the road. Then we'll rejoin the platoon at the valley entrance." As Wilson maneuvered the Sherman back the way they had come, another explosion rocked the draw, this one closer to their position. The German artillerymen were finding their range. If they scored a direct hit on the thin top armor of the Sherman, the result would be catastrophic. Faster, Robert urged. They've got our position bracketed. The Sherman's engines strained as Wilson pushed it to its limit in reverse. They were nearly back to the road when the distinctive sound of a tank engine, deeper and more powerful than their own, reached Robert's ears. "Contact!" he shouted. "Tiger, approaching from the east." Through his periscope, Robert caught a glimpse of the massive German tank emerging from behind a small copse of trees about 500 yards away. Its long gun was already traversing toward them. "Driver, hard left," Robert ordered. "Get us behind that outcropping." Wilson spun the controls and the Sherman lurched sideways just as the Tiger fired. The shell passed overhead, close enough that Robert felt the displacement of air through his open hatch. "That was Wagner, adjusting for our movement," Robert said grimly. "He knows how we operate." They reached the protection of a rocky outcropping just as another artillery shell impacted nearby. They were caught between the Tiger and the artillery, a perilous position with limited options. "Sir," Miller reported, "Anderson is moving to support us, approaching from the south." Robert made a split-second decision. "Tell him to target the Tiger. We'll make a run for that drainage culvert at 2 o'clock. Use it to approach the road from below." The plan formed in his mind as he spoke. The culvert, a large concrete pipe running beneath the elevated road, would provide cover from both the Tiger and the artillery. If they could reach it, they could then use the road embankment as protection while they rejoined the platoon. "Driver, on my mark, make for that culvert entrance. Maximum speed, don't stop for anything." Robert waited, counting the seconds between artillery salvos. They were firing in a pattern, 3 shells, then a pause of approximately 20 seconds as they reloaded and adjusted aim. 3, 2, 1, mark! Wilson gunned the engine and the Sherman burst from behind the outcropping, racing toward the culvert entrance about 200 yards away. The tank bounced violently over the uneven ground, making accurate fire impossible for either side. The Tiger fired again, the shell impacting the ground just behind them, showering the rear of the Sherman with dirt and rocks. Robert kept his focus on the culvert, now 100 yards away. "Almost there," he encouraged. "Keep going." Artillery shells began falling again, but they were aimed at their previous position, giving them precious seconds before the German observers adjusted their fire. 50 yards, 40, 30. The culvert loomed larger, its circular opening just wide enough to accommodate the Sherman if Wilson angled it correctly. 20 yards, 10. "Brace for impact," Robert warned, as the Sherman hit the sloped entrance to the culvert at full speed. There was a tremendous jolt as the tank dropped several feet into the water-carved depression leading to the pipe. For a horrifying moment, Robert thought they had become stuck, the front of the tank dipping too low for the tracks to gain purchase. But Wilson was skilled, modulating the throttle perfectly to maintain momentum without digging in. The Sherman lurched forward into the relative darkness of the culvert, the sound of their engine amplified by the concrete walls surrounding them. "We're through," Wilson reported, proceeding to the far side. Robert allowed himself a momentary feeling of relief as they traversed the length of the culvert, emerging on the far side where the road crossed over the draw. Now the substantial road embankment protected them from direct fire from both the Tiger and the artillery. "Radio Anderson," Robert instructed Miller. "Tell him to disengage and fall back. We'll regroup with the platoon and reassess." As Miller relayed the message, Robert surveyed their position through his periscope. The road embankment provided good cover, with a clear path back to the valley entrance where the rest of the platoon waited. But something didn't feel right. Wagner wouldn't give up the pursuit so easily, not when he had them at a disadvantage. "Driver, hold position," Robert ordered. "I want to see what he does next." Through the periscope, Robert scanned the area where they had last seen the Tiger. At first there was nothing, then movement caught his eye, not from the expected direction, but from further north along the ridgeline. The Tiger was moving rapidly, paralleling their position. "He's trying to cut us off," Robert realized. "He's heading for the valley entrance to trap us in here." The tactical situation suddenly became clear. The artillery had driven them exactly where Wagner wanted, into a confined space with limited exit options. Now the Tiger was positioning itself to block their escape, while the artillery could continue to pound their position. Robert considered their options. They could try to outrun the Tiger to the valley entrance, but the heavier German tank had the advantage of the ridgeline road, while they would have to traverse more difficult terrain. They could try to hide and wait for reinforcements, but the artillery would eventually find them. Or they could do something unexpected. We're going to engage, Robert decided. Driver, proceed along the base of the embankment toward that bend ahead. We'll use it as a firing position to catch him as he descends toward the valley entrance. The Sherman moved forward cautiously, keeping tight to the embankment for protection. As they approached the bend, Robert caught another glimpse of the tiger, now descending a slope toward the valley floor, just as he had predicted. Range to target? He asked Thompson. 800 yards in closing, the gunner replied. He'll cross our line of sight in about 30 seconds. Load HV app, Robert ordered Romano. Last one, sir, the loader confirmed, ramming their final high-velocity armor-piercing round into the breech. Robert made a quick calculation. At 800 yards, even their special armor-piercing round would struggle to penetrate the tiger's frontal armor. They needed a flank shot, which meant timing their appearance perfectly. Driver, on my command, move forward just enough to give the gunner a clear shot, then be prepared to reverse immediately. The seconds ticked by as Robert watched the tiger's progress through his periscope. The massive German tank was now fully committed to the descent, its speed increasing as gravity pulled its 56 tons down the slope. 700 yards, Thompson updated. 20 seconds to optimal firing position. Robert felt the familiar calm that preceded combat, his mind clear and focused on the task at hand. Gunner, aim for the lower hull, just above the tracks. That's where the armor is thinnest. Target area identified, Thompson confirmed. Ready on your command. 10 seconds, Robert counted down. 5, 3, 2, 1, now. Wilson edged the Sherman forward just enough for the gun to clear the embankment. Thompson acquired the target instantly, his years of experience evident in the smooth precision of his movements. On target, he announced. Fire, Robert commanded. The Sherman's gun roared, the 76mm HVAP round streaking toward the tiger's exposed flank. Through his periscope, Robert watched the shell impact exactly where aimed, just above the track assembly on the right side. There was a flash as the round penetrated, followed by a small jet of flame erupting from the point of impact. But the tiger didn't stop. Instead, its turret began traversing rapidly toward their position, the long 88mm gun swinging around like the finger of death. Reverse now, Robert shouted. Wilson threw the Sherman into reverse, backing rapidly behind the protective embankment just as the tiger fired. The 88mm shell impacted the earth where they had been moments before, the explosion sending debris raining down on their hull. Did we damage it? Romano asked. Hit confirmed, but it's still operational, Robert replied grimly. Load standard AP, it's all we have left. As Romano prepared the regular armor-piercing round, Robert assessed their situation. The hit had obviously damaged the tiger, but not critically. Now Wagner knew exactly where they were, and they had used their last special anti-tank round. The radio crackled with Anderson's voice. Mitchell, we're approaching from the south, can provide supporting fire in approximately 2 minutes. Acknowledged, Robert replied. Target is a tiger at the Northern Valley entrance, currently engaged with us. Be advised, enemy has artillery support on the eastern ridgeline. Even as he spoke, another artillery barrage began, shells impacting along the embankment that protected them. The Germans were adjusting their fire, walking it closer to their position with each salvo. We can't stay here, Robert decided. Driver, proceed south along the embankment. Maximum speed. We need to link up with Anderson before that tiger repositions. Wilson engaged the throttle and the Sherman surged forward, keeping tight to the protective earth wall as they raced southward. Through his periscope, Robert could see dust rising from the valley entrance, Anderson's tank approaching. If they could coordinate their fire, they might have a chance against the tiger. But Wagner was too experienced to allow that. As they rounded a bend in the embankment, Robert spotted the tiger again. Not where they had left it, but moving rapidly along the valley floor, cutting directly across to intercept them before they could reach Anderson. Contact front, Robert called. Tiger at 11 o'clock, 400 yards in closing. I see him, Thompson confirmed, already traversing the turret to track the threat. Robert made a split-second decision. Driver, hard right, then straight at him. Gunner, aim for the right track assembly. We can't penetrate his armor, but we can immobilize him. It was a desperate move, but their options were dwindling. Standard AP rounds couldn't reliably penetrate a tiger's armor, but a direct hit on the tracks or running gear might disable it long enough for Anderson to arrive with his own HVAP rounds. The Sherman turned sharply, then accelerated directly toward the oncoming tiger. Through his periscope, Robert could see the German tank clearly now, its gray bulk growing larger by the second, its turret already trained on them. Range 300 yards, Thompson called. 275, 250. Robert knew they were in a race against time. Whoever fired first would have the advantage. Steady, steady. The Tiger fired. The 88mm shell screamed toward them, striking the ground just in front of their right track and exploding. The Sherman lurched violently as fragments tore into the track and front right wheel assembly. "We're hit," Wilson shouted. "Right track damaged." The Sherman slewed sideways, its right track now moving at a different speed than the left, making control difficult. "Keep going," Robert urged. "Gunner, fire when ready." Thompson didn't hesitate. The Sherman's gun roared, sending their standard AP round toward the Tiger. The shell struck exactly where aimed, impacting the right track assembly of the German tank. There was a metallic clang audible even over the engine noise, followed by the distinctive sound of track links breaking. "Hit confirmed," Thompson reported. "Their right track is damaged." Both tanks were now partially immobilized, facing each other across shrinking distance, like two wounded predators in a final confrontation. The Tiger's turret continued to function perfectly, its 88mm gun already being reloaded for another shot. "Driver, hard left," Robert ordered. "Get us behind that rise." Wilson fought with his controls, the damaged track making maneuvers difficult. The Sherman veered left, moving at perhaps half its normal speed, heading for a small rise that might provide temporary cover. The Tiger fired again. This time the shell struck the Sherman directly, impacting the upper front hull with a sound like a giant hammer striking an anvil. The tank rocked backward from the force of the blow. "Frontal armor penetrated," Romano shouted. "Fire in the driver's compartment." Robert looked down to see flames erupting around Wilson's position, the young driver frantically trying to beat them out with his gloved hands. "Wilson, get out! Everyone bail out!" The order to abandon the tank was one no commander gave lightly, but Robert knew the Sherman was doomed. The penetrating round had likely ignited hydraulic fluid or fuel, and a catastrophic explosion would follow within seconds. Robert pushed open his commander's hatch and half climbed, half fell from the turret as smoke began filling the interior. He landed hard on the ground beside the tank, rolling clear as Thompson and Romano emerged from their hatches. Miller followed, dragging Wilson, whose uniform was smoldering. "Clear the tank," Robert shouted, pulling Wilson further away from the stricken Sherman. "Take cover behind that rise." They had barely reached the small earthen protection when their tank erupted in a massive explosion, the ammunition in the storage racks cooking off in a chain reaction that sent the turret flying into the air before crashing back to Earth several yards away. Mustang Sally, their home for nearly a year of war, was gone. Robert quickly assessed his crew. Miller had minor burns on his hands from helping Wilson. Thompson seemed unharmed. Romano had a cut on his forehead from the evacuation. Wilson was the worst, with second-degree burns on his arms and face, but he was conscious and alert. "Stay down," Robert instructed them, peering cautiously over the rise. The Tiger sat about 200 yards away, its right track clearly damaged, but its turret still operational. The 88mm gun was trained directly at their position, but it wasn't firing. Perhaps Wagner was waiting to confirm targets before expending another valuable shell. In the distance, Robert could see dust rising, Anderson's tank still approaching, now perhaps a minute away. If they could just hold out until then. The Tiger's commander's hatch opened. A figure emerged, tall and lean even at this distance, standing upright in the turret with binoculars raised, scanning the battlefield. Wagner. For a surreal moment, the two tank commanders observed each other across the war-torn valley. Robert prone behind his earthen cover, Wagner standing tall in his turret. Then the German officer raised his hand in what appeared to be a salute. Before Robert could react, an artillery shell screamed in from the eastern ridge, impacting near the Tiger. Wagner dropped back into his turret, closing the hatch. "Friendly fire," Miller observed. "They can't see the markings from that distance." Robert nodded grimly. The American artillery, spotting the tank battle, had joined in, not realizing they were firing on their own disabled Sherman and a Tiger that was now effectively out of the fight with its damaged track. Another shell landed, this one closer to the Tiger. Through the dust and smoke, Robert saw the commander's hatch open again, and figures begin to emerge. Wagner's crew abandoning their tank as he had just been forced to do. In the chaos of artillery fire now falling across the battlefield, Robert lost sight of the German tankers. By the time Anderson's Sherman arrived minutes later, the valley had become a landscape of craters, burning vehicles, and smoke. The final confrontation between Robert Mitchell and Heinrich Wagner had ended in a draw, both tanks destroyed, both crews forced to abandon. But in war, survival itself was sometimes victory enough. Robert's reverie was broken by the sound of applause. The formal ceremony was concluding, the crowd responding to some final remarks by the museum director that he had completely missed. As people began to rise from their seats and move toward the tiger for a closer inspection, Jason approached, camera in hand. "That was quite a speech, Grandpa," he said. "You had everyone captivated." Robert nodded absently, his mind still partially in that valley near Castle. "Did you get what you needed for your documentary?" "More than I'd hoped for," Jason confirmed. "But there's one more thing I'd like to film. You taking a closer look at the tiger, examining some of those details you pointed out to Dr. Whitfield yesterday. Would you mind?" "Of course not," Robert agreed, allowing his grandson to guide him toward the now uncovered tank. The crowd parted respectfully, many nodding or murmuring thanks as he passed. As they approached the massive vehicle, Robert noticed a man standing beside it, the Bundeswehr officer he had spotted earlier. Up close, Robert could see he was in his 60s, with close-cropped, gray hair and the erect posture of a career military man. The officer stepped forward as Robert approached, offering a crisp salute that seemed to come from another era. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said in lightly accented English. "Colonel Werner Wagner, German Army. I believe you knew my grandfather." Robert felt a jolt of surprise, quickly followed by understanding. "Heinrich's grandson," he said softly. "Yes, I knew him, though we never actually met face to face." Werner Wagner nodded. "Until his death, my grandfather spoke of you with great respect. He kept all your letters." "As I kept his," Robert replied. The two men regarded each other for a moment, the weight of history tangible between them. Then Werner reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small metal object, a Knight's Cross, the high German military decoration that Heinrich Wagner had earned for his service. "My grandfather wanted you to have this," Werner said, holding it out. "In his last letter to you, which was never sent due to his death, he asked that if we ever located you, this should be given to you as a token of his respect. Soldier to soldier." Robert stared at the decoration, momentarily speechless. Finally, he shook his head. "I can't accept this. It should remain with your family." Werner smiled slightly. "He anticipated you might say that. He wrote that in that case, I should tell you this. Mitchell, don't be stubborn. Even in chess, the kings exchange salutes when the game is done." A chuckle escaped Robert despite himself. It sounded exactly like something Wagner would have written in one of his letters. With a nod of acceptance, he took the Knight's Cross, feeling its weight in his palm. "Thank you," he said simply. "No," Werner replied. "Thank you, Lieutenant Mitchell, for remembering him as a soldier, not just an enemy, for recognizing the man inside the machine." As Jason discreetly filmed this unexpected encounter, Robert found himself thinking of Wagner's final diary entry, abruptly cut short as his tank was disabled. "Mitchell found us. Clever maneuver through the valley. My driver is dead. Tank disabled. We are abandoning. No time for more." No time for more. Yet here, 80 years later, there was time at last. Time to complete the story, to acknowledge the humanity on both sides of a terrible conflict, to recognize that even in war's darkest moments, honor and respect could survive. Robert turned to gaze once more at the Tiger tank that had played such a pivotal role in his life. "Your grandfather was a formidable opponent and an honorable man," he said to Werner. "I'm glad to finally meet his family." As the three men stood beside the silent steel behemoth, Robert felt a sense of completion. The circle that had begun in the Norman countryside in 1904 for war was finally closed. The hunter and the hunted had both, in their own ways, found peace.